Hey guys, welcome back to Houdini Houdono episode 3, right? This is a 10-part mini tutorial series and we're in the third episode. So thanks for your feedback for the first two. I see that a bunch of you have been asking for the rendering part of the tutorial, so I'm going to try to include that into this one. In this video, I'm going to show you some rigid body dynamics, but just to give a premise of this tutorial series, this is a tutorial series for beginners, but not absolute beginners. So if you need to know how to get around Houdini, I highly recommend Houdini Isn't Scary. You can search that up on YouTube, and after you are familiar with the basics of Houdini, you can come here and follow along the simulation tips, right? One of the objectives of this series of tutorials is to show you some very cost-effective simulation setups that is actually used for production work. It's meant to be an introduction, but I will show you at least the very basics of how to art direct your simulation, so that we get a little bit of control in our simulation. I will keep this series short because everybody is busy, maybe around 10 to 15 minutes. But I've read the comments for the first two videos. I get that you guys actually are asking for the rendering portion of the video. So I will try to fit that in, but pardon me if I cannot keep the video short. I hope that's okay with you guys. Maybe it will run to 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, so I should also mention that the objective is to show you very cost-effective setups. And by that I mean setups that are quick to simulate and look kind of cool, so that we all feel encouraged while learning this what is known to be kind of scary a piece of software, right? Then it's up to you to take the deep dive. If all goes well, what you're seeing on screen now should be the effect that we're going to achieve today. You should see some balancing pebbles. Okay, and how we're going to do it, we are going to use the rigid body tools in Houdini. And it is really very simple to set up, just that we need to spend a little bit more time to tweak some simulation parameters so that they behave in a balancing way, right? So welcome back to the series, and let's get started. So here what you see on screen is the setup that I have that is actually rendering now. I'm going to create a new file so you can follow along. So new file. In order to achieve the effect of stacking pebbles, we need a vertically stacked line of pebbles. So what we can create in Houdini is a line. And then we model a single pebble and copy onto the points on this line. Then we can vary the number of points and the size of the pebbles using some attributes. And after which we'll run a rigid body simulation to make them stack on top of each other. Once that is done, we can deform the pebbles in a way that it looks like it's balancing itself. However, the pebbles will then start to intersect with each other if we do not run a rigid body simulation. So we will run the rigid body simulation again, and with that we will be able to achieve the effect that we saw in the intro, right? So we are now here in Houdini. I've created a setup node and I dived inside. So now I'm going to create a line as mentioned earlier. So this line by default ranges from 0 to 1. If I click on this button over here, I can see how many points there are. There are 2 points over here, but I need more pebbles, right? So I'm just going to use the resample node. By default, it's going to use this function here based on maximum segment length to determine the number of points. I do not want that because I find more control, at least in this setup, to use maximum segments here and change it to 7, which then results in 8 points on my line. Okay, so I'm going to create a pebble now. I'm just going to use a sphere, and I'm going to change the radius of my sphere to 2 by 2 on the x and z axis, so that it's kind of squashed like this. That's what the pebble kind of looks like. You can tweak it to your liking. Next, I'll increase the frequency just a little bit, and then I'll just drop down a copy to points node to copy this sphere onto these points over here. Let me turn off the display of each point, and you can see that the pebbles are too big. To vary the size of the pebbles, I'm going to drop down attribute randomize. And if we remember from the previous two episodes, the way to randomize the scale of the copy to points is on the second stream, we'll vary the attribute called p-scale. And it's a one-dimension attribute ranging from say 0.01 to 0.1. So you can see that I have just some pebbles over here now. I'm going to create another attribute randomize over here, and by default it randomizes the colors, so that's kind of what I want. Let me just change the seed over here to some colors that I think are a little bit more varied. And finally, I'm going to drop down a point wrangle to solve a very tiny problem I see here, that from the side view my first pebble is intersecting the ground like this. So what I can do is to just type a simple expression that my position y plus equals my current p scale. So what this does is it moves every point, but in particular the first point, by the radius of itself so that it sits nicely onto the ground. Okay, once that is done, I can jump back here and then I will drop down an assemble node. So this assemble node is interesting. Prior to the assemble node, we will see that there are 1,000 points over here, right? So Houdini doesn't immediately recognize that these are 8 pebbles, right? But with the assemble node and checking this very important checkbox to check called create packed geometry, it essentially allows the rigid body solver that we're going to append to this network very soon to understand that there are 8 pebbles here, right? So let's drop down the RBD bullet solver. Just before we run the simulation, let's change the frame range to 1 to 100 and set the real-time toggle. So let me just run this simulation. We can see it fall through the ground. That's because on the rigid bullet solver, we didn't set a ground plane. So we can select the rigid bullet solver, go to ground, and choose ground plane. And for good measure, we can turn the bounce to 0 so that it's not so volatile, and run the simulation again. So this is what we want, except that we want to do the balancing act instead of having it all topple over like this, right? There are some things I want to change. For instance, I think it's nicer to have some smaller pebbles at the top and a larger pebble at the bottom. So I'm just gonna tweak a little bit over here, and you can see that I'm clicking around the attribute randomize because I don't remember which one I used for which attribute. So I'm just gonna label over here as p scale, and this other one over here as CD, right? The color diffuse. So if I'm going to randomize at p scale, I can jump over to the options here and change the seed. I should set my display flag to copy the points when adjusting my p scale. So find a size that works for you. So I think this is pretty okay. There's some different sized ones. Don't worry if they're intersecting a little. I think the first bullet solver will attempt to solve some of these intersections, right? So let me play this back. So that's fine. That actually looks pretty cool. The thing to look out for is I actually am looking for a start point for the simulation. So I'm using, we'll jump to the side view. I'm using the first bullet solver to find a good starting point where everything is connected together. Of course, I can mathematically try to stack the pebbles together, but I'm kind of lazy to figure out the mathematical formula to find out the p-scale and how to stack them based on the varying height of each pebble. So I'm just going to use this rigid body solver to do it. So I can see that on the frame 7, it's actually what I want. It's slightly intersecting, so I'm just going to come over to the solver here and increase the substeps to 100 and just solve it again. So it's a little bit more accurate now, and I can see that this frame is what I want. Frame 7 here. I will drop down a time shift node to ensure that I freeze this frame at 7. So just by Control Shift left clicking, I break the expression and it's now stuck at 7. So no matter where I scrub in the timeline now, it's gonna have this frame. So there we have it, stacked some pebbles on top of each other. We want to remove all simulation attributes from this bullet solver so that we can use this as a starting point, because there might be some residual velocity attributes on these pebbles here. So let's do that by dropping down a clean node and then check remove attributes and remove groups, right? But we do need the path attribute and the name. So I'm going to specifically remove the V and the W over here. So let's type V and W. Those are the velocity and the spin attributes. Okay, so once that is done, I'm just going to drop down my final rigid body solver, RBD bullet solver. I must remember to turn on my ground plane again. Turn off the bounce for good measure. We don't want something too volatile. And then we need to figure out how to keep this in a straight line. To do that, actually I already have it in a straight line over here, right? So I can pull this out to make this my reference shape that my solver should try to respect. Okay, so I'll drop down a null here to say that this is my reference target. And then I'm going to dive into my bullet solver, and this is where we can input some forces to try to control our simulation. And in here, I'm going to drop down a pop attract. And in this pop attract, the default settings is to look for the world position 0 and try to move all my little rigid bodies towards it. But that's not what I want, so I will choose points instead and choose my sort path to point to, scroll all the way up and point to the reference target. And be sure to change this to per point per particle, and it will reference the ID attribute. So what happens is, on every simulation frame, it will try to match this guy as much as possible. So let's run the simulation now. So we can see that that did not work. It still falls apart because on the pop attract, we need to go to the force tab and increase the force scale. So let me change it to 20. You can see, oh, okay. So it's trying to keep its balance now. So this is working fine, except that towards the end is very volatile. So I'm going to drop down 2 nodes to ensure that it doesn't go all haywire towards the end. That is to add a pop drag, which allows for some air resistance in the space. So it looks like this now. And one more is pop drag spin, which controls the amount of spin that it can have. So this is fairly okay. I just want to make sure that it's less volatile towards the end. This peak force distance introduces some extra force in order to try to keep to the target points, and I find that by increasing this a little bit, it gets a little bit more stable. We notice that this pebble always get out of place, and that could be because the pebbles are right now way too smooth, right? It's way too smooth over here, so let's add a little bit of imperfections on this surface by dropping down a mountain node. Drop down a mountain node, drop down a subdivide, so I'm just gonna use 2 nodes to try to model this surface properly. And also perhaps give it some UVs. UV unwrap my sphere here. We can see now on the copy to points that they are all facing the same direction, and it's kind of unnatural for all the pebbles to be exactly of the same shape, but we can get around this by just rotating them around the vertical axis. And to do that, there's once again another attribute randomize, and this time we're going to randomize the orient attribute. Orient. So the orient attribute works like this. I think, yeah, for those who know quaternions and stuff like that a little bit better, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But we can specify that we want to only modify on the y-axis like this over here, while the x and the z will just not have any randomization. And on the y-axis, I'm going to have a randomized rotation for each point. So this is a 4-dimension attribute that we have to set. And if we want to randomize the seed of this rotation, we can jump to the options tab and tweak the seed over here. So just go for something that looks kind of natural, and we can continue. Okay, so this one here looks pretty alright, and we're going to use this. I need to find the frame that they all sit on top of each other, and that shall be frame 8. So I'm going to change my time shift now to frame 8. Just do a clean, and now I can run my simulation like this. Yep, so it's kind of behaving now. You can see that towards the end, this guy runs out of its place, right? In order to curb with that, I can try to increase my pop drag a little bit more to 2. Okay, as you can tell, this simulation will require some tweaking on your own, and it's literally quite a balancing act. So just find the values that works well for you. Then I can show you some other ways to mitigate some things like slippage. Or if they appear to be almost not touching each other, we can potentially increase the volume of each pebble a little bit just to visually cheat it. Right now I'm going to introduce some bending on my little stack of pebbles over here on my reference, right? To do that, I drop down a bend node over here, and I'm going to set the capture direction to 1. If I adjust my bend over here, I can see I'm bending this stack, right? And it's plus and minus 90 is a good start. So I'm just going to write an expression to say sine my current frame will give me something like this. Not very visible, so I'm going to multiply by 60. So we can see it move like this and back. Except that the current frame is too low a sample. So I'm going to multiply current frame by 30 so I can get something like this. But I think that's a little bit too volatile, so maybe 10. I think this is okay, but we want it to diminish over time. And to do that, I'm going to multiply by my current frame divided by my last frame. So this actually is the opposite. It increases over time, right? The magnitude increases over time. So I'm going to flip that around by using a fit O1 function and mapping 0 to 1 to 1 to 0. Okay, so what this does is it starts off with a big magnitude and over time it gets lesser and lesser. Obviously you can set the keyframe yourself. I just wanted to use expressions for this. And also it starts off very bent, so I do not want that. I'm just gonna look at my first value over here. It's 10.3147. I'm just gonna go to the end of this and minus 1.3147. So that it starts off straight and then it bends. Right? So this is now our target, our reference target, and let's see what the simulation does for us. So you can see that the bend over here allows me to create this little bend like this. But what's also interesting is if I create a transform node over here and just rotate it on the y-axis by going to the rotate here and press $FF, and you can see that we create this illusion, or maybe I multiply the effect by 10. We create the illusion of it trying to balance itself, right? So maybe multiply by 3 is enough. 2 is trying to balance itself, right? So this allows us to get a better illusion of that. Right, so we can see it is doing its little balancing act. And at times we can see that they are almost seemingly not touching each other. We can size up per pebble a little bit. And how to do that? We can do that by preparing a thicker set of these pebbles over here and then transferring them onto positions over here. So what do I mean by that? So here we have per pebble, right? I can use this peak sop over here. I can very subtly increase the size of per pebble and then use the same copy the points node and the same assemble node so that I generate the same path attribute and name attribute. And with that, I can then use transform pieces to then copy my new geometry to my simulation output. This is what it was, and this is now what I can potentially cheat it to be. 0.025, just enough will do, right? So that we give the illusion that they are all in contact with each other. Once we are done with that, we can cache out the simulation. And this workflow is particularly good because if you haven't noticed, we could in effect add more subdivisions here, model it further, and then use these transform pieces to then copy onto a more lightweight simulation. So just to be clear, I will drop down 2 nulls, and this is the low res sample and this is the high res sample, and this low res sample is the one that's feeding into our simulation here. Before the copy to points, we can see this is the low res, and this could be then the high res sample feeding into our simulation here. So just to prove a point, I'm just going to subdivide it further over here and introduce a new mountain. And we can see that this is the high res sample and this is the low res sample. And we can see that even post simulation, we can copy these new pebbles over, right? Just to make it an extreme, I'm going to show you that I can do this now on the fly, right? And I can also peek it on the fly. And this is all after a lightweight simulation. There are some restrictions to this. If we push it too much, the proxy geometry that's used to simulate the RBD simulation might be too far from our actual rendering geometry, and that's where we might face this problem of things appear to be not in contact with each other, right? So just exercise caution when doing this. So I think I'm just going to disable these few nodes, right? And we're done. So the next part of this is to render this setup, and I'm just going to drop down a null here to say out pebbles. We don't want to render our setup node at all. we want to create another geometry node here, call it Pebbles, dive inside and drop down the object merge and pick up the out pebbles over here. Why do we want to do that instead of rendering the setup? It's because sometimes we have multiple outputs in the setup and we want to be able to control its rendering properties separately. So for example, now on my pebbles here, I can assign different materials and control the tessellation differently from the other objects that I may have. Okay, so now I need a ground. I'm just going to drop down a grid. This is the ground. I say BG1. I drop down another grid for the wall behind, and just by rotating this 90 degrees, move it back a little bit, and one more grid, BG3, rotate this 90 degrees, move it back a little bit, and I think I can size all the backgrounds down by half. Yeah, something like this will do. Okay, and maybe for my two walls, I'm just gonna raise them. Okay, once that is done, I have some environment. I'm going to be using Redshift to show you this setup, so I'm just going to drop down a Redshift light dome. Pick an HDRI. I downloaded this HDRI from Polyhaven, and I'm just going to leave that as it is. Turn off the display because I don't want to see that gizmo. And next, I'm going to just press render and see what I'm missing. So I was missing a camera. So let's change this cam1 name to render cam for good measure. And then I'm going to go to my object context, press Ctrl 1 for a quick mark, the material context, press Ctrl 2 for a quick mark, and go to the out context and press Ctrl 3 for a quick mark. So I can toggle between them 1, 2, 3 like this. And now I'm going to select my Redshift output node and choose to render the entire frame range. Now I'm going to press 2, jump to my material context and drop down a Redshift material builder. Call it Pebbles, and jump to my scene view and drop down this material onto my pebbles here like this. Alt drag, and what that does is it quickly duplicates the node that you just alt drag, and I'm going to assign the background to these 3 planes over here. Okay, with that, I'm going to choose to go to my render cam, press this padlock to lock my camera's positions and translations to my viewport, so that if I adjust my viewport, I'm actually adjusting my camera, and just stage these pebbles like this, and just run a little playback to ensure that everything's working fine. And finally, I'm just gonna go to my render view and press render, and I can see this, right? So this is the time where we can tweak some the rotation of our lights like this, to get some nice directional shadows, maybe more like this. And finally, I'm going to download some stone textures or pebble textures from polyhaven.com. So this is the one I used. I can walk you through it. I went to polyhaven.com/textures and go to the search function and type stone. And I found this aerial ground rock that fits quite well for pebbles, and I chose 1K and the zip file and pressed download. After it's downloaded, I unzip, and then there's this displacement texture, the diffuse texture, and the roughness texture. So these 3 are the ones that I want to use. And now let's jump back to Houdini. Let's just do some arrangement of our geometries a little bit. These 3 are our background nodes, so let me just arrange them and drop a null here in case I want to rotate it. So now I have a convenience rotation here, but I don't want to do that. Next, I'm going to adjust my background shader. I don't want the ground to be so reflective, so I'm going to change my roughness reflection to 0.5. Give it enough samples and choose a nice diffuse color. In this case, I'm going to choose this blue over here. It's a little bit too saturated. I'm going to lower the saturation and increase the brightness of the blue, and lower the saturation further to something like this. And next, I'm going to jump to the Pebbles material and assign the stone texture. So I can drop down a texture, RS texture, and pick up the textures that were downloaded. So I'm just going to paste the directory here and pick up the displacement for one, the roughness for another, and finally the diffuse, right? So I'm using the ASL's workflow, so we have to pay attention that we set the color space for our displacement and roughness to be utility raw over here, and for our diffuse texture to be utility sRGB texture, which is over here, right? And just so that we know what we're doing, this is the diffuse, This is the roughness, and this is the displacement. To make use of the displacement information, I need to drop down a displacement node and just plug it in like this, and ensure that I scale down the scale first to 0.1, just in case it explodes, and jump out to my material, my object context, select Pebbles, and enable tessellation and enable displacement. So you can see it displaces like this. It's a bit too strong, so let me jump to adjust the displacement amount here. So we can see that it actually pushes it out along the normals. This is because the information comes in from 0 to 1. Instead, I want to push it from -1 to 1, so that we get some surface detail without increasing the size too much, right? And then I can dial this down to 0.1 or 0.2. And then I'm just going to drop my diffuse into the diffuse color here. And we can see that it's very shiny now. I'm just going to drop my roughness into the reflection roughness here. And with that, I got my pebbles, except that they look very boring. So I'm just going to use a Redshift color correct and increase the brightness of my texture a little bit, and also to vary the color per pebble. So how do I want to do that? I can use the color attribute, the CD attribute. So to do that, drop down the attribute node, it defaults to CD, and you can see that I can use it to plug it into the hue, for example, and we got some variance in the hue. Just know that the hue slider ranges from 0 to 360, so our color attribute now ranges from 0 to 1. So if I want some variance like this, I have to drop a range node and just map it to 360, then I get all the different colors. You will see that the render doesn't update because I need to press the refresh in order to pull the CD attribute. Right. The last time we pressed the render, it did not export the CD attribute for render. So remember to refresh if you are going to call on new point attributes. Okay. So I just want to range, say from like a 32 variance here and -32. Right. So I can get some color differences. And next, I am also gonna have some saturation differences by doing this. So maybe everything is equally saturated like this, but some of them are duller. And finally, the levels, I can just drop it down to 2.5. Increase my displacement a little bit. It's too much. Okay, and in my example, you will see that I have some white colored rocks and some dark colored rocks. So I'll take this even further. To introduce a mix of two materials, I can drop down another RS material here. And on the preset here, I can choose platinum or iron. Okay, so now after wiring the iron in, we can see this over here. In order to mix these materials, we can use the material blender here, RS material blender. And what it does is it can blend the base material with a material from one of the layers. So I'll use layer 1 in this case. And we need to input something into the blend color here. So the value I will use is the CD attribute, and I will use a ramp for this. And just to preview what this ramp does, let me just feed it to the surface. If I refresh my render, you can see that it gives me a random value between black and white. If I pull my range nearer like this, I can make sure that there's not too much blending. There's a very clear separation between black and white. So I can set this to 0.51 and set this to 0.49. And then I can use my noise amount. So this is quite convenient in Redshift to just increase this to 1, and I can increase my noise frequency. I can choose which values I want to be the base material or layer 1. I would like to get some variance, something like this, and just check that we have now variance. Just press the refresh button over here, and oh, I didn't plug my RS ramp into the blend color here, so do that, and you can see some of it is silver over here, right? And the rocks I used in my example are all black and white rocks. So let's see how we can achieve that. So to do black and white rocks, I can actually drop down a ramp node and just feed this into the diffuse color over here. Right, this essentially allows me to create some black rocks and white rocks like this. Well, the only problem is that they don't look so natural, so I may want to then multiply this, vector multiply, with my brown texture that I prepared earlier, and just wire it back into the diffuse color like this. Right, so I can click on the isolate select and show you what's been done so far. So this is the CD attribute, right? We are taking only the scale attribute, the black and white information, and remapping it to the hue and the saturation to achieve slight variance in this texture over here. This is a little bit dark, so I'm just going to increase this to 10. And actually, on my saturation here, I'm going to lower it further to something like this. And finally, on my hue variance, I'm just going to make sure that I don't get too much into the green zone. And then I will take this ramp over here, which right now it's too little variance. I'm just going to change this to 1. Just adjust my frequency such that I get a different kind of variance here. And it's okay for this to be less contrasty. And then after the multiplication, I get something like this. And then that's how I get the variance in the pebbles over here. They look a lot more natural like this, so I'm going to keep this look. Okay, so the setup is done. I'm just going to scrub through the timeline a little bit. From the very choppy render, we can see the balancing act of these pebbles over here. So just before I conclude the rendering portion, I'm just going to hover over my render view and press O and turn on the bokeh. And with that, I can use one of the tools here, which is click to focus, and just turn the tool on and click on this object to focus on it. And alt click to drag to determine the amount of blur we want. So just use it sparingly, don't go overboard. Sometimes it's difficult to control, so we can turn on the palette over here and just dial down to 0.05. That's where we get some bokeh in our shot. Just a little quick tip, we can introduce a little bit of movement into the shot very quickly in Houdini by selecting our render camera and drop 2 nulls over it. So one null here and another one, alt drag over here. I like to use this one on the rotation Y is $FF, and we can get some rotations like this. So it's kind of cool, but it's kind of fast. So let me change the expression to multiply by 0.1. You can see that there's some movement over here. And next, on our second null, we can right click on the translation and go to motion effects and choose noise. Right, this allows us to have some free camera shake generated for us. Let's just change the amplitude to 0.1. And it's a little bit shaky for my liking, so I'll change the period to 3. And still a little bit shaky, I'm changing my harmonics to 2. Right, you can see the graph here is representational of how much shake we have. And this helps us to very easily create some camera movement that feels handheld and organic. And for good measure, let's just rename these nodes to orbit and this to shake. Okay, and then maybe hide the display for these 2 nulls. And the render cam. And this null too. Okay, so that concludes the rendering portion. It's been requested by a number of you to show the Redshift setup, so I hope I covered enough in this video. And please let me know if you want me to include the rendering portion of the setup in the next few videos, because actually the setup is pretty much the same, so I don't know if you will actually benefit from it. So yeah, please let me know. All kinds of feedback have been helpful so far, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed the setup in this video, and please tag me if you actually followed along. If you have some nice results, you can find me on Instagram at the handle Ronald_Fong. And yeah, I'll annotate this file, so if you need this working file to reference, just go to Instagram and just drop me a DM, and I will give you a link to the file, or just put it somewhere for you to download, right? Okay, I think that's it. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next Friday, 6 p.m. Singapore time, right? See you in the next episode. Bye.